As all of you know, I'm sure too well and very well, the world has changed dramatically this week, and we have a lot to learn and a lot to process. And we're going to talk about Trump foreign policy today, which is a great unknown to us and perhaps to him as well. But it's critical to the American future, and it's critical to the Jewish future. And I want to introduce myself. I'm Nadine Epstein. I'm the editor and publisher of Moment Magazine, among other things. And you should have a copy of all this in the magazine in your packet. It has a very important story about anti-Semitism in this campaign, which I think is of very importance to all of you and all of us and everyone who's not even Jewish. And also an interesting story, a very important symposium on the growing gap between Israel and American Jews. And we're going to be talking to a dear and honored, wonderful guest, Aaron David Miller, who I hope most of you all know already. He's currently the Vice President of New Initiatives and a Distinguished Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in D.C. He has worked for Department of Secretaries of State as an analyst, a negotiator, and an advisor on Middle Eastern issues to both Republicans and Democrats. And he has written a very, I think, prescient book called The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. And his articles have appeared in Washington Post, the New York Times, LA Times. He's on CNN and NPR and MSNBC and Fox. And he's a very thoughtful person, and I'm so delighted, and thank you so much for being here today.
Nadine, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad, even at this turbulent and difficult moment, that I am here.
Yeah.
Let me just say something at the outset. I'm not a rabbi. I'm not a philosopher, and I'm not a grief counselor. I'm not here to make you feel better or to make you feel worse. And I cannot say, with all due respect to my children. They're not really children anymore. They're in their 30s, who have been profoundly disturbed and upset by recent events, that I can tell you that everything is going to be okay. I myself am torn in part by the millions of my fellow citizens who are now driven by fear and pain on one hand, and my own profound belief in the goodness of this great country and the durability and resiliency of its institutions, however imperfect. I mean, I'll say to you at the outset that I've worked for Republicans and Democrats. I voted for Republicans and Democrats. My own view of smart policy for the United States is not driven by the division between left and right, liberal and conservative, or Republican and Democrat. It's driven by the difference between smart on one hand and dumb on the other. And the only thing that matters, frankly, is which side of the line do you want America to be on. And trying to create circumstances and the wise choices to make sure that America is on the smart side is critically important. One other point about my own personal views. I am a follower, I guess, I'm not a religious person, but I am a follower of the great Protestant theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, who argued with respect to America, or frankly life in general, that the best you can do in business and marriage and friendship and diplomacy is to come up with proximate solutions to insoluble problems. Proximate solutions to insoluble problems. That, I would argue to you, is the story of America. I do not believe in transformations. I'm very wary of them, frankly, given the nature and the way we approach change in this country. So I will do my best without grossly speculating or driving off the highway to answer some of these questions in a gap and a vacuum with respect to information that clearly is galactic.
Well, we don't expect you to be
scale.
a prophet today,
No.
okay? But all of us have to start processing, and we have to process as soon as possible so we understand what's going on. So let's start with the new president-elect, does he really care, or does he really care about foreign policy to begin with?
Whether he does or not, no president, including the ones I worked with and the ones that I've studied, can afford not to. I mean, the president's primary responsibility is not just keeping Americans prosperous, but keeping them secure. And the security of this country is clearly going to be a critical agenda item for the next president, as it was for this one. I would suggest to you, though, that given the cruel and unforgiving nature of the world that our current president inhabited, and the cruel and unforgiving nature of the world the next president will inhabit, that the prospects of finding comprehensive solutions, certainly to any of the problems in the Middle East, are probably slim to none. And in large part, I would advance the argument that the next president's agenda will largely be domestic in character and nature. If you look at his speech at Gettysburg, you'd be hard-pressed to find a priority issue that didn't have to deal with
jobs, immigration,
any number of domestic priorities. So that could easily be undermined by the unpredictable world in which we live.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, I think that's what this incoming administration will focus on.
Does he care about Israel? Because I think I want to talk about Israel and the conflict in Israel first, and then we're going to move to Iran and a few other major places. But does he care about Israel from anything he said in any deep way?
Again, as much as I believe that a president's personality and proclivities and inclinations are critically important in informing a president's policies, having worked for a half dozen administrations, both Republicans and Democrats, I basically advanced the argument that there is no way any U.S. president can inherit an office and not wrestle with and frankly care about the future security of the state of Israel.
Well, who are his advisors now? I mean, I've read a little bit about this guy, Jason Dove Greenblatt and David Friedman. These are real estate lawyers who work with him, or his advisors on Israel. And do you have any idea of what they're advising him to do with Israel right now, or how to deal with the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians?
Rule number one, however disappointed you may be, at least in my survival guide to Washington, is I do not talk about personalities I know, let alone about personalities that I don't.
Okay.
And in this case, I do not know either of these individuals. I think it will be instructive to see on the national security appointments who ends up with Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor. Again, I come back to the reality that there is no way, and it's been my proposition from the beginning through any number of administrations where there have been many ups and downs in the history of this relationship, including an administration that was perceived to be one of the most anti-Israeli administrations, and I had the privilege and honor of working for both George H.W. Bush and James Baker, that by and large, there will be much more continuity in American foreign policy when it comes to Israel-related issues than fundamental change and or contrast, and I think that will be the case here.
So what should a Trump administration, what should be their approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
On this one, I may in fact disappoint you, because my own analysis since leaving government 13 years ago has been, these are my own words, annoyingly negative. I do not believe that the man or woman in the middle, that is to say the mediator, is nearly as important as the two, in this case, men on either side. You give me three things which do not exist right now, and I'll give you a reasonable chance of creating circumstances for a serious negotiation, even leading to, with all of the hesitations and reservations, a two-state solution. Number one, you give me leadership, leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their constituencies. You give me ownership, the fact that Israelis and Palestinians will care more about this conflict and taking the core decisions required to resolve it than any external parties, and you give me effective U.S. mediation. I would even settle for one of the first two, which would potentially lead to the third. But of the three, leadership is critical. There's insufficient leadership on both sides. Ownership, I would argue, is even more critical. It was Larry Summers who said, and he was right, that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. And the fact is, you don't wash rental cars because you care only about what you own. It may be a sad testament to the human condition, but it is in fact true. And unless Israelis and Palestinians own this in a way that they're prepared to engage on it because it makes a difference to them, primarily and profoundly, then the odds of effective mediation by the United States or any third party, chances of mediation will be
So we just should
slim
give
to
up
none.
on a two-state solution now, pretty much for the next 4 or 8 years?
No, I don't suggest we abandon and hang a close for the season sign on any of these issues. Look, I'm with Elie Wiesel here. Without hope, there's no life. But I'll tell you one thing, and I second rule of thumb, at least in my personal philosophy, I will not continue to harbor the illusions that I harbored about an American role during the 20 plus years I was working. I mean, it's a moral responsibility not to abandon hope, but it is an imperative not to see the world only the way you want it to be. You have to reconcile that with the way the world is.
Okay. Well, I read this article an interview by this guy, Jason Dove Greenblatt, who I also haven't met, who said that Trump often uses money to settle conflicts, and that he thought this was a way that you could settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I was wondering what you thought about the role of money. You know, basically it was buying the Palestinians off. And is that something that, I mean, that was the closest I could find to a kind of a policy comment.
Right.
And I didn't know what you thought of that.
If I had a nickel for every time during the 20 years I was working on this problem that somebody came to me, or one of the administrations that I worked with, very well-intentioned and understandably altruistic plan, a Marshall Plan, a plan to improve the economies, particularly on the Palestinian side, well, the fact is, economics, financial incentives, trade and aid are extremely important, but they cannot substitute for decisions in a conflict that is driven by politics, by religion, by psychology, and by historical trauma and wounding on both sides. It simply will not compute. So if you want to reduce America's relationships abroad and try to create opportunities by using incentives and to reduce every relationship we have to a bottom line business proposition, I don't think you're going to succeed. Look, in part, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in fact a real estate proposition, but it is only in part, and it cannot be approached from that perspective.
That's a really interesting idea. So how about this relationship between Netanyahu and Trump, which we really have no idea what it is and what it's going to be? How does that spell for the future of the relationships between the United States and Israel?
I mean, I've seen American presidents and prime ministers interact with one another over the course of a 40-plus year period. There has been tremendous dysfunction in those relationships, lack of personal trust, and yet the most dysfunctional of the relationships ended up creating productive outcomes. That's the paradox. It was true of Begin and Carter. It was even true of Richard Nixon and Rabin and Golda Meir and Kissinger. It was true of George H.W. Bush and Shamir. It was even true of President Clinton and Prime Minister Netanyahu in its first incarnation. You had dysfunction, but dysfunction led to production. I would argue, just to set things in context, that over the last 8 years, we've had a dysfunctional relationship between the current president and the Israeli prime minister, and it has not led to production.
It led to a $10 billion military agreement, actually.
It did. Well, $38 billion over a 10-year period. But remember that the U.S.-Israeli security relationship is, in many respects, self-sustaining. The question is, when you join issues that require critically important decisions on the part of Israeli prime ministers and American presidents, can you produce a productive relationship? So bottom line on this, and remember, we're 2 months before any of these propositions can be road tested. I would suggest to you, I wrote in the Wall Street Journal last week that there will be clearly a change in the tenor and tone and style of the relationship between the next president and Mr. Netanyahu. I predict, for a very important reason, and we need to talk about it, that probably within a year, they will be annoying the hell out of one another. That does not mean, essentially, that there will be fundamental changes in that relationship. That does not mean that we will go back to the dysfunction that characterized the Netanyahu-Obama relationship. But there's one fundamental point which needs to be stressed over and over and over again. I had two Israeli prime ministers, Yitzhak Rabin and Benjamin Netanyahu, basically say the same thing to me, which was this. You live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Do not preach to me, exact words, do not preach to me about what you believe is good for my country's security. And the reality is, I understand the downside of accepting the logic and implications of that argument, but I also never forget it, which is why it is virtually impossible, I think, not to understand and certainly not to trivialize the fears and anxieties and realities of small powers with dark pasts living in dangerous neighborhoods. And let me be more precise. I'm not here to sound like a representative of the Israeli Ministry of Information. This is something that the United States has a very hard time understanding. We are in the most extraordinary geographic position of any country on the face of the earth. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, and we have fish to our east and west, what one historian brilliantly described, I wish it had been me, as our liquid assets. These two oceans, these liquid assets, in my judgment, if you want to explain American foreign policy, you start with the basic proposition, like the real estate business. I come from a real estate family. It's all location, location, location. And where we sit largely determines where we stand. That is not the case for small powers who are sitting in very dangerous places. And I would just conclude by saying the following. We have freed ourselves to a large extent from two forces which will continue to affect the psychology and the worldviews of most of the countries in the world with which we deal. We have freed ourselves from geography, and we have freed ourselves in large part from history. That is not the case with the Chinese. It is not the case with the Russians. It is not the case with the Palestinians. It is not the case with the Egyptians, the Israelis, and the Iranians, and we must never forget that elemental fact. It does not mean that we need to simply sit back, but it does mean that the way we see the world has to be reconciled to some degree with the way other people see it, and this is a critically important point.
We are indeed blessed. I agree. Let's move to Iran that's a pretty important topic here. What do you think Trump is he's really going to try to, what can he really do to derail the Iran deal? He's been talking about this now for months and months and months, but what do you do, and is he really going to do it?
I mean, as you look at the future, and again, we are really operating in a vacuum. I would argue that the next administration arguably has three discrete options. One is abrogation. That is to say, on my first day of office, I am simply going to unilaterally abrogate the agreement. I'm going to withdraw American support for it. I will have nothing to do with it. I will essentially no longer seek waivers for a suspension of sanctions, but I'll put my administration on record as canceling it. Second is renegotiation. Mr. Trump has said during the campaign that this is the worst agreement ever in the history of negotiations, and that he would intend to somehow renegotiate it. I think abrogation is probably not an option on day one. I think renegotiation, that would be reconvening the P5+1 to somehow renegotiate an agreement that it's already embodied in the UN Security Council resolution. I think that's unlikely. I think the third option is the most likely. And let me be clear, I have been a critic of the agreement. It's imperfect. It's a arms control agreement that was negotiated in order to serve several narrow objectives. It is not a transformative accord. It was never designed to comprehensively end the problem of Iran's putative search for a nuclear weapon. I'm a Rolling Stones fan, and I've written repeatedly that the Iranians got what they wanted out of the agreement, and this administration got what it needed. That may or may not be the case, but I think, by and large, option 3 may prevail, which is, I guess, an option driven by the following logic, that if you don't work assiduously to maintain the agreement, and remember, you're going to see the passing, certainly on the American side, of the core negotiators who invested quite a lot in it. If you do not, on one side and the other, the future of Mr. Zarif and President Rouhani, given presidential elections this coming spring, is highly unclear. I think if you don't have people who are actively working to maintain an agreement that is politically explosive in the United States, opposed by powerful elements in Iran, even though the Supreme Leader, for many reasons, has acquiesced in it, then I think it's conceivable that you will see, I don't want to be over dramatic here, you could use the word death spiral. That's a kind of too dramatic a characterization, but you can see an unwinding of this accord over time.
In what way? Like, what would we see first?
I mean, I think look, an administration could choose, a lot of this has to do with positioning.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you want to assume the major responsibility for the unraveling of the court? Do you want to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you want to make it, make your interlocutors do it? And I think that will be a key consideration in the new administration going forward, if in fact the decision is made to allow it to wither on the vine. Congress is another potential mechanism. You have an enormous number of Republicans who do not like this accord. There are Democrats who don't like it either. And there will be very few constraints on congressional actions. The Iran Sanctions Act is due to expire, I believe, at the end of the year. Will it be renewed cleanly as the House wants and many Democrats, or will it be loaded with additional provisions that could start, at least in Iran, a process of pushback? And finally, let's be clear, every new president is going to be tested in many different ways by America's friends and its adversaries. And I would predict, it's hardly a genius sort of prediction, that early on in the next administration, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard alone will probably want to test this administration in the Persian Gulf.
Well, speaking of testing, let's move on to Syria and ISIS. So what can Trump really do that's different than Obama has been doing? It's not like we're in such great control and have so much, we don't have that many choices. So that's my question.
Yeah, I would argue, and I've wrestled with this question as well, on the issue of humanitarian interventions. The gap between American rhetoric and American action on this particular issue in Syria may well be the tragic, terribly cruel poster child for this basic problem. Whatever our rhetoric, our policy on humanitarian interventions from the Nazi Holocaust through Cambodia, through Rwanda, through Darfur, through Congo, with the possible exception of Bosnia, has been pretty bad. I would put Mr. Obama's policies on Syria, I consider them in many respects smart but highly risk-averse. I would put Mr. Obama's policies, and I think you must put his policies, within the broader context of America's unwillingness, inability, failure. You can moralize all you want on how we intercede or don't in situations where we are faced with mass slaughter and mass killing I'm hesitant to use the word genocide, but clearly in the case of Khmer Rouge and Rwanda, that was the case. But how does the United States comport itself in these situations? And I would argue that our track record has been consistently risk averse. And it is that more or less informs my analysis of the way this president has comported himself toward Syria. I think he may be judged harshly in the wake of his administration for being too risk averse, but to get on to the next administration, I think that you'll see if you add up everything that's been said during the campaign and the kind of bottom line paradigm that is applied to many of the problems that America faces, its relationship with its allies, the free rider characterizations of some of its allies like the Saudis, that you're going to see a continuation of not risk readiness, but risk aversion. Paradoxically, had the election come out a different way and the Democrats won, you might have actually seen more risk readiness on the part of Mrs. Clinton than you are going to see on the part of Mr. Trump in Syria. And I think that risk aversion, however, will take on at least three different aspects. Number one, there will be a serious effort to test the proposition that some sort of deal can be cut with Mr. Putin under the guise of, or in the service of, pursuing a more aggressive policy against not just the Islamic State, but the other not so sleeping problem in Al-Qaeda Central's efforts through its derivatives, Fatah al-Sham, the old Nusra, to increase its presence in Syria. And not with a view toward creating a caliphate necessarily, but using it as a sanctuary to plan and to attack Western interests. That will be aspect number one. Number two, I think there will be an effort to look at the whole issue of the $1 billion that the agency, CIA that is, supplies to training opposition groups against Mr. Assad. And finally, I think there may be, and I hope there is not, there may be an actual effort, strains the bounds of credulity to the breaking point, not only to dismiss the Assad must go rhetoric, but essentially to accept in a more activist way the reality that Mr. Assad is not just part of the problem, he may well be part of the solution. So I think these things will be road tested perhaps, but they do represent, I think, new innovations in the way the next administration may handle the Syrian crisis.
So Trump portrays himself as a risk taker and as a poker player and, a kind of a gambler in a way. And so your thinking is that he's not going to be able to put these skills to work specifically in Syria or in there, or maybe you don't see him portraying himself that way, but that's what I hear.
I mean, well, there's a difference between being unpredictable or wanting to be seen as being unpredictable on one hand, and on the other, adopting a policy which fundamentally would essentially contradict the policies of this administration. And in this regard, I think there'll be more continuity than contrast. I do not believe you're going to see an effort by the next administration to plunge itself into internal conflicts to try to put the Syrian and the Iraqi Humpty Dumptys back together again. That was not the position that this administration took in the face of severe criticism.
Is there a positive in this unpredictability? Is there a silver lining to the unpredictability now in foreign policy?
I think the way it's been explained, in my judgment, the answer is decidedly no.
Okay.
And this does, in fact, get you on to the issue of temperament and what are the qualities that are critically important to become an effective foreign policy president. And I will say, without getting in the middle of this, let me just tell you a story. In 1982, I was a lowly INR analyst at the State Department working on Lebanon. That's the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. It's one of the 16 units that comprise our intelligence community. And INR has very few analysts, unlike CIA. I was the Lebanon and Palestinian analyst for the entire State Department at a very important time in American policy toward Lebanon. I was writing very controversial assessments for then Secretary of State Schultz, which were not terribly popular. But I'm sitting at my desk one morning, and the phone rings, and I pick it up, and I hear on the other end of the line, hold please, it's the White House sit room calling. So no music, I'm holding 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. All of a sudden, this is what I hear on the phone. Aaron, I said, yeah, this is Vice President Bush calling. I read one of your memos on Lebanon. I read one of your memos on Lebanon, and I was wondering if you have 5 minutes or so that we could talk about it. So he was wondering whether I had 5 minutes to talk about it. And I thought to myself, I had known that Kennedy called the Vietnam analysts directly when he didn't feel as if he was getting what he needed from the president's daily brief or the briefings themselves. And I thought to myself, not at the time, but years later and now, I thought to myself that one of the core elements of being an effective foreign policy president is curiosity. It's curiosity. It's the capacity to know what you don't know and being in a hurry to find out. And frankly, this is not a Republican talking point. It is not a Democratic talking point. It is an American talking point. And the fact is, this is critically important, truly critically important, and I hope that the next administration, through all of its appointments, and the president himself, understands this critically important issue, because when you live in a museum, and that's what the White House is, it's a museum. You're sitting at a desk used by one of the founders, you're surrounded by pictures. It can be incredibly inspiring and uplifting, but at the same time, you live in a hermetically sealed bubble. And it really does make it imperative that the people around you tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And that you yourself understand the nature of that hermetic seal and try to the best of your abilities to figure out a way to hear as many voices as you possibly can.
That's true. Thank you. Let's switch right now to Putin for a second. So what could the new Trump administration do to contain or to deal with Putin in Syria? Is there something that can be done more than what we've been doing, hopefully?
I mean, look, Mr. Putin functions according to the two sort of elements that I referred to earlier. He is a prisoner of Russian history. He's a prisoner of Russian geography. And as a consequence, he's chosen to project his power in areas where he believed Russian interests matter and where the projection of that power might conceivably play well at home. That's Crimea, despite the fact that it costs him a fortune every day having annexed it. It's eastern Ukraine. It's Syria, where he has a 40 or 50-year relationship with the Assads, and he's determined for any number of reasons to frustrate American objectives and not allow Mr. Assad, as Mr. Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein have fallen under the pressure of American military power. That is his objective. Not to take over the Middle East. I think he's too smart, frankly, to get to, he's not going to violate the notion that great powers should intervene in the affairs of small tribes only at their own risk. He's invested, and frankly, up until now, he's gotten considerable returns from that investment. Unless an administration, any administration, this current administration, a putative Clinton administration, or a Trump administration was prepared to make the kinds of investment in Syria that would be sustained by a U.S. Congress and by a risk-averse public, tired and exhausted from the two longest wars in American history, where the standard for victory was never could we win, but when could we leave? Unless an administration is prepared to make that kind of investment in Syria, then the necessary leverage that is required to compete with Mr. Putin on the ground, with Hezbollah, with Mr. Assad, and of course with Iran, I don't see how you push or confront or impel Mr. Putin to basically change his policy. If that is in fact the case, and that was in large measure the case during 8 years, since at least 2011, with this administration, and the next administration is risk averse, not risk ready, then the default position has to be, doesn't it, some kind of deal, some kind of accommodation. Now, whether that's possible or not, it was not in the last 2 years of this administration, I haven't a clue. But the mindset going into this enterprise strikes me as not confrontation. It's not a no-fly zone in which we are prepared to challenge, if not destroy, Russian aircraft. It is not, despite talk of a safe zone, an enterprise in which we are prepared to deploy thousands of American ground forces in order to keep a safe zone safe, which is in large part the problem with safe zones. If you don't, it strikes me that negotiation is likely to be the default. Negotiation and cooperation are likely to be the default positions, not confrontation.
What about democracy building in the Middle East right now? Or because I guess there are actually some of the advisors that in the new Trump administration, or possible advisors that seem to hold that kind of position. And what do you think? Is there, and just briefly, is there, what do you think of democracy building at this point?
I suppose I'm a foreign policy realist, although I don't subscribe to the notion that if you're a realist, that means putting order before freedom and putting interests before values. That's what a realist is. Order before freedom and interest before values. I think I'm not quite prepared. The order for freedom part is problematic, it seems to me, because it would mean acquiescence, if not support, for authoritarian regimes around the world. But the truth is, the gap between over time, the gap between our propensity to want to change the world according to the values by which we live and our capacity to deliver on that rhetoric, that gap has, in my judgment, helped erode American credibility, which has fallen into it.
Yeah.
And I would only point out that great powers behave anomalously, inconsistently, and hypocritically. It is in the very nature of the job description of the great power to behave that way. We invade Iraq, but not Syria. We want an Arab Spring in Egypt, but not in Saudi Arabia. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I would only suggest, I would never give up the idea that we should always promote American values. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we have to be extremely careful when we elevate these values to a level of rhetoric that implies action on our part. And I think the war amongst values, interests, and policies in this foreign policy is going to be extremely difficult to harmonize. And I suspect the Trump administration may well follow what the default position the Obama administration came to in the last several years, mm-hmm. That it's extremely difficult. If you say Assad must go, if you basically want to continue to talk about a comprehensive settlements freeze in Israel, if you say anything and you can't or won't make good on what it is you're saying, then you are not respected, you are not admired, and you are not feared. And a great power operating in this part of the world mm-hmm. has to at least be some of all of those things in order to be credible. So just to conclude, mean what you say and say what you mean.
Okay, great. So we're not going to be able to get to Saudi Arabia and a few other Turkey or some of the other countries I'd hope to, but I do want to ask you, how do you think, this is our last question, and we'll have maybe a very, very brief Q&A. How will Trump, the candidate, translate into Trump, the foreign policy president?
I mean, I'll say at the outset that the gap between, let me start this way. It may be time to take the science out of political science. I guess I don't mean that literally. Some would argue we need more science. But after the Arab Spring, after Brexit, after the violation of every conceivable political law of gravity in both the primary and the general election, which is confused, confounded, but proved the vast majority of the experts, people who spend their lives studying this question, I think it's virtually impossible to say. It seems to me that the ultimate test is coming. Can the laws of governing be suspended as well? And that is a frightening proposition, however imperfect the institutions of this republic really are. I can't answer it. As I mentioned to you before, and I hear both of my kids telling me, whispering in one ear, Dad, this is a lot worse than it's ever been, and it's going to get worse than even you think it is. And I am torn as a human being, as an American, as a member of the Jewish community in this country. I'm torn by the fears and the pain that have driven so many people to a level of distraction and upset that I have not seen. I've seen it in my lifetime briefly in response to Jack Kennedy's assassination, that kind of grief and outpouring. I've seen it in the wake of 9/11. I've never seen anything like it here, on one hand. And on the other, I'm caught in the throes of a country that I love, whose values I think, however imperfect, are worth preserving. And frankly, I don't know. I wish I could tell myself and the rest of you and my own children that it's going to be okay. I hope that is the case. But the ultimate test, it seems to me, is coming, and I think it will require a measure of time to actually administer it to see where we come out. And that's about the best, frankly, Nadine Epstein, I can do at the Washington Hilton this morning.
Thank you, Aaron David.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.